are these people?
So I
Gotcha.
wanted to get to our last thing if you still got time. It's
I
like
got I
it's
got a
like
few minutes.
50, last story. It's a little bit by Danny. I think you've had him
Hmm.
on your show before, I think.
I'm trying to get him on my show.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
I'm trying to.
So he writes the ghost stories of capitalism. Racism is real and it's a class struggle. So this is
Mm,
in conjunction with Black Agenda Report. So from culture wars to identity politics, it's easy to get sucked into toxic rhetoric and forget the reality of racism staring the US in the face. And it begins to quote from Malcolm, you can't have racism without capitalism. So, in
Right.
today's political climate, the word racism has become taboo. Some on the left take issue with the term because of how it has been co opted by the neoliberal elite. This is understandable since the neoliberal Democratic Party has indeed exploited race relations in the United States to forward a lesser evil. But no less
mhm.
dangerous brand of U.S. imperialism, racism is thus increasingly viewed as an ideological weapon of liberalism rather than a material force of oppression. So called conservatives have pounced on the limitations of neoliberal racial politics to strengthen their own brand as crusaders against the woke politics of the Democrats. The problem with all this is that racism is a very real manifestation of class struggle. Racism isn't merely the hateful words and behaviors acted out by individuals. It isn't simply a set of institutional problems that can be reformed away at the workplace or the criminal justice system either. Some on the liberal left say that racism is systemic, but even this is misleading. Failing to name the system, U.S. imperialism, decontextualizes racism from its roots in class power. So, understanding racism as an expression of class power is not merely a thought exercise. U.S. race relations permeate every aspect of material life for working people. Racist ideology has a clear psychological impact, and disparities in policing, incarceration, healthcare, unemployment, and wages have life and death consequences. The purpose of the Ghost Stories of Capitalism series is to strengthen a leftist analysis of political economy and exploitation through the personal experiences of Danny Haiphong. By telling his stories, we strengthen our capacity to move forward, to participate a class struggle for genuine liberation from the imperialist system at the root of oppression. Great start by Danny. Thoughts so far? Anything?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm speaking as a Black person and even as an immigrant, it hits different as a Black person,
Hmm.
because you
Yeah.
deal with the idea of your skin color, and then usually in the society you're deemed a lower class.
Hmm.
Even like if you're like an elite, you know, you still would can be considered, and especially for me growing up in those circles, I grew up, like especially like high school, college, like I went to elite schools, but I was not necessarily as accepted, quote unquote, in those circles,
Mm,
as among my peers because I was Black, so I
Hmm.
wasn't necessarily in with them totally, if
Hmm.
at all.
Hmm.
So I
what
think
about
that
you,
ideal
JB?
or feeling kind of permeated,
Yeah.
for me in my adulthood.
So when you look at the socioeconomic status of Black people within this country, you'll see the wealth disparities between them and white people. That shows that class and race are intrinsically linked together when it comes to Black people. That says it right there. Like, people can go, oh well, it's not intrinsically linked, and if that was the case, then the wealth disparities between races would not exist.
Right.
Yeah.
So the fact that the wealth disparities do exist between races already shows that class and race are intrinsically linked. It's just some people are ignorant to the findings, or they're looking the other way and they don't want to see it. But when it comes to us, as well as the generational class divide that has happened due to us being locked out, like, for instance, things like the New Deal, the GI Bill, being locked up. There was, I forgot what year it was, but there was a point in time when Black people couldn't even have life insurance.
Yep.
So, with that being said, the accumulation of wealth was not possible for us at all. And so, unfortunately, within this country, white people have had hundreds of years of a head start while we're just now trying to catch up. And even still, we can't catch up.
Let's preface by saying, you know, like, generally, we know that there are some white people who do struggle, you know.
Of course,
so
yeah.
Because I'm sure there's going to be some people in the chat who are going to be like, well, I'm white and I'm poor, so, like, you know, yeah.
Oh,
But
of
I
course.
think as a race,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like, there are certain privileges that are afforded to you if you're white and poor, I would argue, than if you're Black and rich.
Yeah. But
So
I just want it to be known that the white people who are poor are not poor because they're white. That's the issue.
Yeah.
Some of us Black people are poor because we're Black, and some of us are Black because we're poor. Well, not some of us are Black because we're poor. But what the hell was that? But it's like it's synonymous with each other when it comes to this country. Even if you go to the billionaires, there's 6 Black billionaires in this country, if you want to look at it from that direction. That's it. That's it.
Yep.
All the rest of the billionaires are white or non-white, mostly just white. So when you look at it from that perspective, when you look at the racism that we experienced from slavery, when you look at the racism that we experienced from Jim Crow, when you look at the fact that our prisons, 40% of the prison population is Black, even though we only make up 13% of the population.
Yep.
So it goes to show that really the racial disparity as well as the economic disparity go hand in hand. And so for someone to downplay that or say, you guys can't talk about race, you guys need to talk about class, I can't. It's like
both.
It's like, yeah, it's both. It's like intrinsically linked. It's like me and my gender. It's intrinsically linked. I'm a dude and I'm Black. You know, it's intrinsically linked. I can't go outside of that.
So Danny's earliest encounters with racism were marked by the pernicious Yellow Peril ideology, which flourished under the U.S.'s new Cold War regime against China. Many of these encounters happened outside of the home as my Vietnamese mother and white father navigated their own racial contradictions. They also happen outside of the formal education system, since U.S. schools are notorious for whitewashing history and valorizing slave owners in their capitalist project. My race consciousness, so to speak, was planted by peers. Race was an unavoidable fact of life. Asian slurs were frequently employed by peers on the playground and in the streets. Many would cackle at me with stretched eyes to demonstrate that they looked more Asian, quote unquote. I was frequently reminded of racist stereotypes about the lack of sexual prowess possessed by Asians. Some took my perceived Chinese or Asian identity as an excuse to steal my belongings or enact some other kind of violence. Many years would pass before I understood these experiences as an outgrowth of U.S. imperialist policy. Anti-Asian racism manufactured consent for immigration laws banning Chinese laborers beginning the mid to late 19th century, and the U.S.'s wars against China, the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam later in the 20th century. Mistreatment from peers, while infuriating, was not the primary force that awakened me to interconnection between race and class. Witnessing struggle and oppression was the main catalyst. Once I entered adulthood, I realized that we are all children being force-fed reactionary and divisive ideology. Racism was not just about my suffering, but the suffering of masses of people. Such revolutionary empathy is rooted in a number of experiences that reflect the inner workings of a capitalist system reliant on dehumanization to reproduce relations of exploitation. So he remembers in seventh grade social studies teacher who reinforced my school's racist school tracking system by asking me to transfer classes so I would stop hanging with the knuckleheads, a euphemism for poor black youth. I remembered being stopped and frisked in my first year of high school by a city cop and watched my black peers swiftly rush ahead of the scene to avoid the same, if not worse, treatment. I remember the white woman who ran clutching her purse when she spotted my Haitian friend speaking to me at the gate of my building. By the time I turned 21, I attended the funerals of 3 black youth very dear to my heart who died prematurely of suicide, preventable illness, and homicide. One doesn't easily forget the screams of pain coming from their loved ones. I came to understand racism as a mechanism of class warfare in my college years. There was nothing like being surrounded by rich white elites for the first time in my life to cultivate rage at the system. During my sophomore year, an Afro-Dominican student and friend at the college was arrested and charged with a hate crime for getting into a fight with a white person in town and allegedly calling him the N-word. The school immediately suspended him, and his entire future at the university was placed at risk. This seemingly absurd yet unjust turn of events spurred me into activism. He quickly wrote an op-ed in the school newspaper, Danny Did, which caused such a stir among residents and students alike that anonymous death threats came in my direction. I made contact with like-minded students, and we began organizing around issues of race on campus. Our efforts helped create an environment where the charges against the students were dropped, and he was allowed back on campus to finish his education. But we didn't stop here. We continued our activism to tackle other issues such as the lack of ethnic studies or black studies programs on campus, burnout, mounted as liberal identity reductionism, and dialogue were favored by administrators and student activists over significant changes in policy, placing insurmountable barriers in front of change. His frustrations, yes.
Can we just add, we talked about this last week with the Dutch apology regarding their role in the slave trade. The idea we'll talk about it more.
Yeah.
You know, the issue that Black activists had was we've done talked about it, and there are issues, and we also have issues that we've addressed that you haven't mentioned.
Yeah.
We also have a list of demands by CARICOM that you have not addressed. The idea that you want to kind of, again, circumvent that with we need to build more museums, and not even in the countries that is affected, that more museums and better the education, it's not helpful. So just another ploy, capitalist society, again, we'll talk around the issue, but we won't get to the heart because it's, because ultimately it affects their money. That's the thing. It affects their money and it affects their well-being.
I found it interesting. Both of you kind of have done academic stuff, and in those circles, Haifeng's relation with that was, enlightening to say the least. Any thoughts, Jaybe, on those few paragraphs?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to see Danny's experience because you don't want to see that happen to anyone. And this is the reason for wanting to fight for liberation so that you won't see people suffer like this anymore. The liberation is a struggle born out of wanting to stop your suffering and to prevent further suffering from others, which is just, it's rooted in empathy.
Yep.
So I definitely see where he's coming from. This kind of this reminds me of when I was working as a young man in a restaurant, and I was walking as I was walking home. in the more affluent area of town to my bus. I had to walk about a mile to the bus stop because the bus stop that I could go to, it stopped running. So I had to go all the way a mile. And so as I was walking, a car passed me by full of young white men yelling the N-word at me. And I walked, and then not even a minute and a half, 2 minutes later, a car full of young white women screaming the N-word at me afterwards. And I also have memories of being racially profiled by a police officer because I was looking at him a little too long. So a lot of us have these stories, and we don't want to have these stories anymore. And even though I didn't want somebody like Danny to have these stories to tell, because I don't want them to have these experiences, I'm glad that he's using it to spur himself and others to action so that we can have something better. And I like the fact that he's linking it with economics as well.
Yeah, that they're both part of the same thing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
he continues with like my frustration, and I'll just finish this up real quick and we'll wrap. But my frustrations ended up being a blessing in disguise. They led me to a semester-long trip to New York City and a foray as an intern in the labor movement. Occupy Wall Street had just begun, and activists were having intense conversations about race and class. These conversations were often fraught with tension. People spun in circles, arguing about whether race or class were more important to movement politics. The arguments felt worse than fruitless. They felt out of touch with reality. I knew racism and class warfare were interconnected, but I didn't have the language to explain why or how. I began to develop such a language after several friends introduced me to the science of Marxism at the end of my New York semester. Huey P. Newton, Claudia Jones, Fidel Castro, Vladimir Lenin, and a host of revolutionary socialist leaders of the 20th century taught me that U.S. imperialism requires racism to reproduce class relations of exploitation. Capitalists accumulate profit from the exploitation of workers in their system of race-based benefits, places a critical in front of the solidarity necessary to wrestle off the shackles of such a class arrangement. This is no abstraction. Black workers in the U.S. are paid as low as half the wages of white workers for the same employment and are twice as likely to be unemployed. Incarceration and police brutality are experienced at far higher rates by black workers than white workers. Life expectancy is falling for all U.S.-based workers, but is falling fastest in Black American and Indigenous communities. Any class struggle that fails to give these disparities their proper attention is bound to fail. Furthermore, racism is a key pillar of the American empire. All U.S. wars, whether on indigenous peoples in North America or the people of Iraq, have been sanitized by a psychological campaign of dehumanization. American exceptionalism itself is a racist ideology. The U.S. is said to spread democracy and freedom around the world, despite the innumerable war crimes it has committed in the last decade alone. The nations of Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, Russia, China, Cuba, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, the DPRK, and many more have been subject to some act of U.S. warfare. Racist propaganda against each one of these nations has rendered U.S. war crimes that much more effective by creating an endless list of enemies from which to fear. Propaganda is one of the biggest fronts to the America's empire's endless war regime. Those who are genuinely interested in winning the class war at hand must seek truth from facts. The fact is that racism is a very real phenomenon that shapes every facet of U.S. imperialism. Solidarity with and among the oppressed is only possible if the scourge of racism is defeated materially and ideologically. This doesn't mean we conduct a witch hunt for individual racists, but rather that our efforts to win political power possess a built-in and organized intention to develop new human beings. It also means that we deeply study the ways in which racism divides humanity for capitalist profit and domination as we search for the correct methods to wage class struggle and restore the needs of humanity. That was it. Everything Danny had to say on it. Closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, we need to have better discussions. And I've heard this among Black people, like, oh, we just need to worry about race. You know, like, it's like, no, we have to worry about class as well.
I didn't even think about it from that direction either.
They are, you know, and all of it is tied. Like, it's funny, like, just the main theme just tonight. I don't think I don't think we necessarily intended it, but it's just capitalism. You know, it's just the core, it's the root of all this whole, you know, like, but I think we have to look at it from both ends, because I think, especially for Black people, even though we may not necessarily kind of connect it to class, because we're the lowest of the low generally anyway in society, that it like, we don't necessarily think about that. Like, but yeah, it's both. It's not an and or. For I think, especially for us, it's both. And we have to treat it as such.
Yeah.
Any disagreement?
No. In fact, I'll take Collin's point even further. It is necessary within a capitalist system for us to be at the bottom.
Right.
It requires us to be at the bottom. You see, capitalism, in order for it to be able to maintain itself, you have to have separated groups that are separated by a particular type of ideology or mentality, in order for us to stay divided, so that we don't team up together to go up against the capitalist or the oppressor class. So race, which is a colonial construct, has to be divided. And then we have to divide it male, female. Then we have to divide it from hetero to LGB. Then from cis to trans or non-binary. Then we have to do it from native born to immigrant. So there's all these dividers that we have to have in order to keep people, the working class, from actually homogenizing, so that we can overthrow the capitalist class by means of a revolution. Right. And so, but there has to be a recognition that for us, race and class are intrinsically linked. And this is one of the tools that they use in order to keep us not only separate by race, but separate by class as well, to make it seem like we're lower. And remember, I forgot which special it was, but Chris Rock did a special. I don't know if it was Bigger and Blacker or Never Scared. I forgot which one. But he said, I am a rich Black man, and not even a poor white man will want to trade places with me.
Trade places with me. Yeah.
And that is telling, right? It's saying, wait, we can never actually get to where we need to, because not even the poor white person would want to be in our spot, because they know what we go through. And so we have two things working against us, versus a poor white person has one thing working against them. And so it places upon the poor white person, in their mind, yeah, maybe poor, but at least I'm not Black.
Right.
And so it's like, and here's the sad part. If you ask a lot of Black people, if you ask them if they could switch their race, sometimes some Black people will actually say, yeah.
But
Jaybe, do you know, I'm trying to remember what, you follow the comic books. You've read a few of those.
Red, you give me a little more credits.
X-Men was the classic analogy here, right? And how many of them chose to take away their abilities?
Yeah.
This is the same thing. Literal superpowers we're wanting to throw away. you know.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
no, yeah. I mean, interesting discussion for sure. I think it's
Yeah.
definitely important to link those two because they are important. That whole global north versus global south thing, also part of that. You know,
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
it's part of the problems with the space on the left now is class struggle among content creator. Like, you know, that's part of it.
I mean, you
You
know,
Oh
know,
you
boy.
see, well,
like
witness,
it's oh
witness, you know, you've witnessed it and you've seen it with me just even in this year. You
yeah.
know, like, even among like commentators and
Yep.
content creators, like,
Those
you know,
PMCs
like,
be working hard though, don't they? They be working hard.
right.
But anyway,
Well, that's the
speaking of
thing.
working hard.